On an early October day in 1999, two fishermen set out into Colorado's Comanche Peak wilderness on the Big South Trail. They followed the trail up through the most remote part of Poudre Canyon, looking for spots to cast in the river that the trail parallels. While the Big South Trail is certainly beautiful, this area in Colorado is home to tons of other scenic trails. Because of this, I'm sure that most people that hiked it at the time had pretty much forgotten its name by the time they returned to their cars. These two fishermen, however, would likely never forget the name Big South Trail for the rest of their lives. And that's because this trail was about to become one of the most famous hiking trails in Colorado, perhaps the entire country, at least for the time being. About 1.5 miles into their adventure, the two fishermen decided to take a break from casting and started to rest on the side of the trail. Shortly into this break, they were approached by a young boy, and I mean a really young boy, only a few years old. The encounter was brief, and the boy quickly continued on by himself down the trail. Now, encountering a lone child in the middle of the woods is usually a scenario reserved for nightmares or horror films, but the two fishermen were not that concerned. And that's because just a little bit further down the trail, the two fishermen could see a large group of hikers coming up towards them, and they assumed that this boy was simply just a part of that group. Their conversation, their encounter with the boy seemed brief and insignificant, and I guess at the time, it certainly was. However, their encounter with the boy would go on to be analyzed, discussed, and dissected for decades to come. And that's because the boy they ran into on the Big South Trail was no other than 3-year-old Jaryd Atadero. And this encounter was the last time that Jaryd was ever seen alive. This is a crazy one, folks. It's a sad one. I mean, a 3-year-old boy, it's a tough one, I'm not gonna lie. Before we get into it, I just want to please ask, if you are finding yourself coming back to a lot of my videos, please hit that subscribe button. We're trying to get this channel to 300,000 subscribers. I appreciate all of you that have already subscribed so much. So let's get into the story of Jaryd Atadero. This is one of those cases that's very famous. It has like a cult following. And so I guarantee you there's people that are going to watch this video that honestly know more about this case than I do. As I do with every single video that I make, I did my absolute best to make sure all the facts here are 100% true. But you never know, I could have gotten something wrong, and honestly, there could be some facts out there that I just didn't even find in my research. So if you're really familiar with this case, please leave some insight in the comments. And if this is your first time hearing about this case, please go watch some other videos, read some articles, just do more research. Don't just take everything you hear that I say as gospel. On Saturday, October 2nd, 1999, Alan Atadero woke up to a beautiful fall day in the mountains of Colorado. Atadero was the co-owner of the Poudre River Resort located in Rustic, Colorado, about an hour west of Fort Collins. He was currently staying at his resort with his two children, 3-year-old Jaryd and 6-year-old Jocelyn. On this particular morning, Alan's children had heard about a trip that was planned to the nearby State Fish Hatchery, and this trip was being led by the Christian Singles Network group, which was a group that was staying at the resort at the time, and it was also a group that Alan was a part of. Jaryd and his older sister wanted to go on the trip to the fish hatchery, and after some brief hesitation, Alan decided to let them go. What could possibly go wrong, he surely figured. For reasons that are unknown to me, this group decided to change their plans after they had already left, and unbeknownst to Alan. They decided to go for a hike, and they chose the Big South Trail, which was about 15.5 miles away from the resort. It's also unclear to me what this group of 11 people's objective on the hike was. The Big South Trail runs over 10 miles through the Comanche Peak wilderness, eventually entering the boundaries of Rocky Mountain National Park, and it has several intersecting trails and other wilderness trails. There's no obvious end point on this trail for a day hike. That's what I'm getting at, so I'm not really sure why they chose it. I definitely could be missing something, but it seems like the group's plans were made quite hastily. and they weren't really thought through very well. Nobody knows exactly what happened once everyone started hiking, but it's generally accepted that the hikers began to separate into two groups based on their speed. The faster group outpaced the slower group and pulled ahead. It's unknown which of the two groups Jaryd was a part of, but whatever group he was currently hiking with, he must have been feeling good because he actually ran ahead of the group, and that's when he encountered the two fishermen that I spoke about in the intro of this video. At this point, they were roughly 1.5 miles into the trail, and they were in the vicinity of Camp 2. There's 16 designated campsites for backpackers to use along the Big South Trail, and each campsite is marked with a sign similar to the one you're looking at right now. The encounter between Jaryd and the two fishermen was brief, but here's everything that we know. The two fishermen were simply taking a break when Jaryd ran up to them. I don't know what they talked about, but the fishermen did notice that there was another group of hikers 50 to 80 feet below them down the trail in the direction that Jaryd had run up from. The two fishermen assumed that Jaryd was part of this group, though it's unclear to me if they ever received verbal confirmation from Jaryd that he was a part of the group. After their encounter with Jaryd, the boy allegedly began walking rapidly up the trail adjacent to the sign marking Camp 2. It's unknown if Jaryd was ahead of the faster group of hikers or if he was between the faster and slower groups. It is known, however, that after Jaryd parted ways with the fishermen, he was never seen alive again. At some point soon after he left the fishermen, a few members of the 11-person group allegedly heard a scream off in the distance. And one of the members that heard the scream was Jaryd's older sister, who has put forth varying descriptions of the scream in the years since. In one article, she described the scream as playful, as in someone was gonna go tag Jaryd. And in another article, she described it as less playful and more like a shriek. Now, again, she was only 6 years old when this happened, and so much time has passed, and so it's understandable that a lot of the details might be hazy and her accounts might change. But one thing that has not changed in all the years since this happened is that Jaryd's older sister insists that she did in fact hear this scream. About 45 minutes after Jaryd spoke with the fishermen, the group that he was hiking with had fully come to terms with the fact that he was missing. And you might be wondering who was supposed to be responsible for watching Jaryd, and the truth is, we don't really know. Again, it doesn't seem like these plans were put together very well. It doesn't really seem like any one individual took the responsibility of watching the kids. It kind of just seems like everyone assumed that somebody else would be doing it, and that's how Jaryd was able to get away and not get noticed before he went missing. Eventually, Jaryd's father, Alan, was notified that Jaryd was missing, and he began frantically driving towards the trailhead, beating his chest and screaming, quote, "They lost my baby, they lost my baby." Alan eventually reached the trailhead, and shortly after that, the authorities were called in to launch an official search. They initially thought it was gonna be a quick process. The authorities really weren't that worried. Bill Nelson, who was with the Larimer County's Sheriff's Office and in charge of the search at the time, was quoted saying, "My thought was we should be able to get in there with our people and do what we do and what we have done hundreds of times, find the person. It might take a few hours, but we would be done before midnight." Nelson retired to his pickup truck just before midnight that first night of the search, and he instructed those around him to wake him up during the night when they found Jaryd. But instead, he woke up by himself, much later than he anticipated, and with no news about Jaryd's whereabouts. By this point, it was becoming clear to Nelson, as well as everyone around him, that this was not going to be an ordinary search and rescue mission. But even that realization was insufficient to prepare everyone for what was about to happen next. Over 60 searchers had been deployed along the Big South Trail the evening of the day Jaryd went missing, and though this was a strong effort, they knew they needed more. The next morning, Sunday, October 3rd, 1999, an Air Force helicopter helicopter was brought in all the way from Cheyenne, Wyoming to scan the terrain surrounding the Big South Trail. After refueling in Fort Collins, the helicopter returned to the area, but instead of helping the search, it actually made things way more complicated and way more dangerous. The helicopter was struggling with the heavy fuel load and the dangerous mountain conditions, and it eventually stalled out and fell 100 feet down onto the Big South Trail. There were 5 people on board, but only 4 of them were able to escape the wreckage. The one man left inside of the wreckage was a Larimer County search and rescue member, Mark Sheets. Sheets was knocked unconscious during the crash. He was the only person in the helicopter who was not in a seat. He was instead sitting next to the open helicopter door, and he was not wearing a helmet, opting instead to wear a communication headset. After seeing the crash, other search and rescue members who were on the ground raced over, kicked in a window, and pulled Sheets out of the wreckage, likely saving his life. He was taken to the hospital with major injuries, but thankfully, he survived. The news media began to take notice of Jaryd's case after the helicopter crash, and it didn't take long for reporters, journalists, and cameramen to swarm the remote trailhead. The entire country was now watching, and the only thing search and rescue had to show for it was a downed helicopter and a nearly dead search and rescue member. They had 0 clues into what had happened to Jaryd, and they had no idea where he was. Day 2 of the search stretched into day 3, which stretched into day 4, and so on and so forth. Still, they had no answers, and it wasn't like they weren't trying either. Massive ground searches were being done repeatedly, divers were being called in to look in the pools of the river that ran along the trail, and planes searched far and wide from the sky. As the search continued, investigators began to consider other scenarios besides just the one of Jaryd getting lost in the wilderness. Could he have been abducted? Or did an animal potentially get him? That theory became a favorite among investigators because shortly into the search, mountain lion tracks were found in the area. And these tracks were found right next to small, child-sized footprints. But still, they had no proof. And eventually a week went by with no answers. And at this point, the sheriff's office decided to call off the search. Unofficial searches were still going to be allowed, but at this point, the government was done committing any of its resources to actively search for Jaryd. At this point, most people figured that if Jaryd was in fact still out there in the wilderness, it was extremely unlikely that he was still alive. Eventually, and tragically, this would be proven true, although it took nearly 4 years. Let's flash forward to June 4th, 2003. On this day, 2 businessmen from nearby Fort Collins went on a hike on the Big South Trail. The 2 men, Gary Watts and Rob Osborne, were somewhat familiar with the area and had gone on other adventures there before. In fact, on a trip they had taken a week earlier, the 2 men had discussed the mystery of Jaryd Atadero, and so it was fresh on their minds as they made their way up the Big South Trail. At one point, the men found themselves in a rock field that led some 2,000 feet up off trail to a high ridge. And for whatever reason, the 2 men decided to leave the worn, gentle trail behind and began scrambling up this rock field. Now, this terrain is rough. It requires you to go slow and be very careful to pay attention with every single step that you make. Because of this, the men were very focused on the ground in front of them. And about 500 feet into their scramble, they noticed something hidden within the rocks that would have been almost impossible to see in any other circumstance. It was a child-sized white Tarzan tennis shoe. And when the men saw it, they instantly knew who it belonged to. It wasn't long before they located the other shoe and a fleece jacket and a pair of blue pants that were turned inside out. Osborne was quoted saying, "The thing is, we were up there a week earlier and talked quite a bit about the various scenarios about his," referring to Jaryd's, disappearance. "Then we happened upon the clothes and it's mystery solved." The 2 men photographed the scene, they collected some of the clothes, and then they returned to town to report what they had found. And 2 days later, staff from the Larimer County Sheriff's Office were hiking up the Big South Trail to process the scene and to look for human remains. And 11 days after that, they found a single molar tooth and a skull cap. DNA testing would soon prove what everyone suspected. The remains were that of Jaryd Atadero. So was this the end of the story? Was the mystery finally solved with the discovery of this clothing and the remains? Well, it depends on who you ask. My understanding is that the government did kind of officially close this case and give an explanation for what happened. However, for a lot of other people, including, as I understand it, Jaryd's family, the condition and location that his clothing and remains were discovered in ended up raising even more questions than it answered. Now, once again, this is a very famous case and there's tons of different theories out there about what happened. However, I narrowed it down to 3 different scenarios that I think are the most plausible. Again, I could be wrong. I'm not here to tell you which theory is most likely. I'm not here to interject my opinion. I'm just going to give you the facts as I understand them and let you make up your own mind. The first theory is the most straightforward one. Jaryd simply was being a kid, running around. He went off trail, he got lost, and eventually died due to hypothermia or exposure. Unfortunately, there really isn't any strong evidence that supports or contradicts this theory, but for some reason, in doing research for this video, I noticed that this theory, though it is, again, so straightforward, seems to get overlooked in online discussions about this case. Now, I don't know why that is, but it's possible that it gets overlooked because it's much more boring than these next 2 theories. The second theory, which seems to be the official theory put forth from the government, is that Jaryd died because of a mountain lion attack. In fact, the way that I discovered this case in the first place was because I was reading through a Wikipedia page late at night, as one does, listing known mountain lion fatalities. Now, this is the evidence supporting the mountain lion theory as I understand it. First of all, Jaryd's clothing that was discovered had numerous puncture marks, rips, and holes, ones that were, according to authorities, consistent with an animal attack. Also, since the location that Jaryd's clothing and remains were found in was 550 feet off the trail up a steep, rocky slope, it's unlikely that the 3-year-old boy could have gotten up there himself. The theory is that the mountain lion attacked him and then either dragged him up there after it killed him or before it killed him. I don't know. It just seems like really rough terrain for a 3-year-old boy to have climbed up without any assistance, for the lack of a better word. It's also worth mentioning that while mountain lion attacks on humans are extremely rare, they do happen slightly more often to small children, which is why if you're ever hiking with a child and you see a mountain lion, pick up the child as fast and as efficiently as you possibly can. Jaryd's death certificate lists the manner of death as, quote, undetermined probable mountain lion attack, which doesn't really sound all that confident, does it? The truth is that there's actually some evidence in this case that contradicts the official theory, the mountain lion theory. First of all, there was no blood on any of Jaryd's clothing, which, how would that be possible if he died via a violent attack from an animal? And also, even more suspiciously, perhaps, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, Jaryd's pants, his blue sweatpants, were found inside out, which is just very weird. Like, how on earth would a mountain lion turn his pants inside out? And lastly, I read this in one place online, though I can't confirm it. I read that they tested Jaryd's clothing and did not find any trace of mountain lion DNA on it. No hairs, no blood, nothing. And this brings us to the third theory about what happened to Jaryd Atadero. The theory that he was killed as a result of foul play. And much of the evidence that points to this theory is simply the same evidence that contradicts the mountain lion theory. The foul play theory would explain why there was no blood on Jaryd's clothing. Perhaps he was taken out of the clothing before he was killed, or perhaps the blood was cleaned off the clothing. And it would also kind of explain why Jaryd's pants were found inside out. I mean, at the very least, it seems more likely that a human would have done that than a mountain lion. And the foul play theory could also explain why it took so many years for Jaryd's remains and his clothing to be found. Though the discovery was made off of the Big South Trail, my understanding is that it was basically directly above Camp 2, which was Jaryd's last known location. So wouldn't this area have been searched? Is it possible that his clothing and his remains were taken back up there and placed there some years later after the searching had stopped. I'm not really sure. I did read that the helicopter that crashed would have supposedly searched the area where they did eventually find the clothing and his remains. And so I don't know. Another piece of evidence that suggests foul play is that Jaryd's shoes were found in pretty good condition. You know, not brand new, obviously, but not the kind of condition you'd expect after they had sat in the wilderness through 4 Colorado winters. So maybe this theory is true, maybe it's not. I don't know. We don't have any suspects. Nobody's ever been named publicly as a person of interest. So maybe it was a murder or an abduction. Maybe it was a mountain lion, or maybe it was something that I didn't even cover in this video. The unfortunate reality is that we don't and likely never will know the truth about what happened to Jaryd Atadero. It's a really sad story. It's a scary one, and my heart goes out to Jaryd and, of course, his family. This is very unlikely, but there will be thousands of people that watch this video. So just on the tiny off chance that you happen to know something about this case that hasn't been reported, please speak up and say something and get Jaryd's family the answers that they deserve. Thank you for watching, everybody.